So let's take a look at the writer, because if someone's buying, someone else is selling at the same prices. So we create those scenarios. You can remember in the exam, I more than likely won't be giving you the actual prices. You come up with those yourself. So that's why I said earlier on, we all may have different answers. So someone might pick 150 and then 450 as those two extreme values. Or you might be a lot tighter than me. You might have a 260 and a 280. If I were you, do I kind of spread them out a little bit wider like this in terms of the difference, so that you can take account of the premiums and still have a profit in there. What about exercising or abandoning the put? Just remember, like the call, the buyer does that. So the buyer will exercise or abandon. The seller does not have the right to do that because they sold the option. They sold that right to the buyer to opt out of the contract. The seller can never opt out of it. Okay. And just to kind of jump ahead, whatever is positive for the buyer ends up being negative. I'll explain in a moment. So I'm just going to change all of these. Firstly, I should change the premiums because you remember the writer will receive that money from the buyer. So the buyer has a negative, the writer has the positive. And whatever was negative for the buyer in terms of your profit and loss, it becomes positive for the writer. And likewise, whatever was positive for the buyer ends up being negative for the writer. So let's look at why that's the case. And then we quickly draw the diagram. The writer sold the option. It gave the buyer the right to sell at $275. When the stock ended up being $250, the buyer exercised their option and are now able to sell for $250, therefore making $25. Who were they taking that $25 from? Well, the seller sold them the option. They have to give them the $25. So of the $25 that the seller or the writer gives to the buyer, they give them $12.69 of the buyer's premium that the buyer gave them back in April. So they give them $12.69. They still owe more money. They have to make up $25. So they have to give them another $12.31 to make up the $25. So they don't lose $25. They only lost $12.31 because they are using the buyer's premium to give it back to them. Okay. Obviously, if we have a $225 here, they'd obviously, the writer will end up having to pay them more. They'll owe them $50, and of the $50, they give them $12.69, so they owe them $37.31. And you can keep going with those examples, but I recommend you don't. You just stick with what we have here, the 3 columns. What about here then? Let's look at the extreme example because I'll only be repeating myself for the middle one. So let's look at the extreme one. It's easier to look at. The buyer bought the option at $275 to sell at $275, but the stock ended up being $300. So the buyer's not going to want to sell at $275, so they abandoned that option. And because the buyer abandoned that option, the writer is quite happy with that because it means they can keep the premium of $12.69. The buyer will not owe the seller they don't owe the $25 to the seller because the buyer has the right but not the obligation. So they have the right to exercise, but they're not obliged to exercise because they have the option. So they opt away from it and they let the writer just keep the $12.69. That's why you have positive. So at any price higher than $300, say it's even $1,000, the buyer will always abandon the option because they don't want to sell at $275. They'd rather sell at $1,000. And by abandoning that option, the writer just keeps $12.69. So you have a limited gain on the upside. So our diagram is going to be a mirror image of what we just have here. And what we'll do is identify where the break-even is going to happen, and the break-even happens in the same place, okay? Because we kind of have to look at where we're going to start losing our money to the buyer. Because here, I'm just going to write down the buyer exercises at that point, and the buyer, even though we're talking about the writer here, we just have to note that the buyer will exercise or abandon at these options. Just ignore these lines for the moment, these blue lines. We've already marked off that distance here. I'm going to show that distance here for the writer. This is our $12.69, so that's positive. That's money we're receiving. Because the buyer will abandon at those higher prices, you don't receive any extra income. All you do is keep your premium. So I'm just going to bring that line up here. That corresponds to the $12.69 we just see there at the bottom of the table. So you have a limited gain on the when the stock price is greater than the strike. That's why it flatlines. And then when it comes to this line, as I said, it's a mirror image, you start losing your money to the buyer. So when the stock price starts falling, the buyer can exercise their option and you end up giving them their premium back when the stock price is falling below the strike. And if it falls further, you end up having to give them more. So when the stock was 250, you owe them an additional 12.31 on top of the premium. So you gave all the premium away, plus you end up owing more. So if you could drop a line from 250 down to where that negative line is and across, you'll almost get the same equal distance, which is kind of reflective of this anyway. So the buyer exercise, the buyer abandons, you have limited gains, you have unlimited losses down to zero. Here's your strike, there's your break even. You're out of the money, you're in the money, and you're at the money.